April 6, 1945. The small German town of Merkers lay quiet under the pale spring sky, its cobblestone streets still damp from the morning rain. Two women trudged along the narrow road, their worn shoes clicking against the stones with each weary step. They were French, displaced persons torn from their homes and forced into German labour camps, survivors of a system that had stripped them of everything except their will to endure. These women had learned to notice things, to observe without appearing to watch, because in this world of crumbling empires and desperate soldiers, knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. As they walked past a patrol of American military police from the 3rd Army's 90th Infantry Division, one of the women made a decision that would change the course of history. She stopped, gathered her courage, and approached the young Americans. What she told them seemed almost impossible to believe. There was a mine, she said, an old salt mine just outside the town, and in that mine, hidden deep beneath the earth, the Germans had been storing something. Gold. Truckloads of it, brought in under cover of darkness over the past few months. The MPs exchanged glances. They had heard rumours before, whispers of Nazi treasure hidden in caves and mines across the collapsing Reich. Most had turned out to be nothing more than desperate fantasies or wild exaggerations, but something about this woman's story felt different. She spoke with quiet certainty, providing specific details about the mine's location and the patterns of German truck movements. With missing, historical, the information had climbed the chain of command, reaching the desk of Lieutenant Colonel William Russell, the division's civilian affairs officer. Russell was no fool. He understood the strategic importance of denying the Nazis access to resources that could fuel a resistance movement or finance the escape of war criminals. If there was any truth to this story, he needed to verify it immediately. He gathered his men and headed for the Kaiserode salt mine at Merkers, a sprawling industrial complex that descended nearly 2,000 feet beneath the Earth's surface. The mine's entrance stood like a dark mouth in the hillside, surrounded by the industrial debris of wartime Germany. Russell and his team found several displaced persons who worked in the mine, and one by one they confirmed the Frenchwoman's story. Yes, there was something down there, something big. One man, a British sergeant who had been a prisoner of war and forced to work in the mine, provided the most detailed, admitted he was in Merkers for a specific purpose, to care for paintings that had been stored in the mine for safekeeping. The scope of what might be hidden beneath the earth was beginning to reveal itself, and it was far larger than anyone had imagined. The following day was Sunday, April 8th. In Paris, hundreds of miles away, Colonel Bernard Bernstein sat reading the Sunday edition of Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper that had become the primary source of information for American troops across Europe. Bernstein was no ordinary officer. He served as deputy chief of the financial branch for Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the nerve center coordinating the liberation of Europe. His job was to track Nazi financial assets, to ensure that the wealth stolen from occupied nations and murdered victims couldn't be used to finance a Nazi resurgence or line the pockets of fleeing war criminals. When his eyes fell upon a brief article about a possible gold discovery at Merkers, Bernstein felt his pulse quicken. This could be exactly what Operation Safe Haven had been searching for. Operation Safe Haven. The codename alone suggested its purpose, a massive Allied effort launched in 1944 to identify, locate, and recover Nazi assets before they could be moved beyond Allied reach. The operation had been born from a growing realization among American and British intelligence services that the Nazis were not simply fighting a war, they were also preparing for its aftermath. Documents captured from German officials revealed plans to smuggle gold, currency, artwork, and other valuables to neutral countries like Switzerland, Spain, and Argentina. Some of this treasure would fund the escape of Nazi leaders through rat lines, secret escape routes that would spirit them away to South America and the Middle East. The rest would finance the creation of a Fourth Reich, a resurgent Nazi movement that could rise from the ashes of defeat. Immigration of Nazi looting had been staggering beyond comprehension. As Hitler's armies swept across Europe from 1938 onward, they systematically plundered entire nations. The invasion of Austria in March 1938 brought Germany approximately 90 tons of gold from the Austrian National Bank. This sudden influx of wealth, worth hundreds of millions of dollars at the time, gave Hitler the financial resources to continue his expansion. When German forces rolled into Czechoslovakia, Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, they repeated the same pattern. Central bank vaults were emptied, museum collections were catalogued, and jewellery, their watches, their wedding rings, even the gold fillings from their teeth. These items were collected, sorted, and shipped to the Reichsbank in Berlin. There, they were melted down and recast into gold bars, erasing the individual stories of suffering and transforming human anguish into standardized bullion. The gold of the murdered was mixed with the gold of looted central banks, creating a fungible wealth that could be used to purchase oil from Romania, tungsten from Portugal, and precision machinery from Switzerland. By late 1944, as Allied bombers began pounding Berlin with increasing intensity, Nazi officials faced a critical problem. The Reichsbank building, a massive structure in the heart of the capital, had been hit multiple times. Its currency printing presses were destroyed, fire had consumed portions of the building, and perhaps most concerning, Soviet forces were advancing from the east, while American and British armies closed in from the west. Berlin was becoming a death trap, and everything stored in the Reichsbank was at risk. In February 1945, Reichsbank officials made a desperate decision. They would evacuate the bank's most valuable assets to locations where they might survive the coming destruction of Berlin. The chosen destination was a salt mine at Merkers, approximately 200 miles southwest of the capital. Salt mines offered ideal storage conditions for both currency and artwork. The temperature remained constant, the air was dry, and the vast chambers carved out by decades of mining could accommodate enormous quantities of material. Moreover, these mines were deep, some reaching depths of 2,000 feet or more, making them virtually immune to aerial bombardment. Immigration began immediately. Trucks loaded with bags of gold bars, boxes of gold coins, and bales of foreign currency began the long journey from Berlin to Merkers. Each shipment was recorded, logged, and carefully tracked by Reichsbank clerks, who maintained meticulous records even as their world collapsed around them. The gold came in standardized bags, each marked with the Reichsbank seal and containing exactly 1 million Reichsmarks worth of bullion. There were thousands of these bags, stacked and arranged in neat rows within the mine's vast chambers. But gold was not the only cargo making this journey. The Reichsminister for Education, recognizing that Berlin's museums were also at risk, ordered the evacuation of the nation's art treasures. Paintings facing their greatest threat in a world consumed by total war. The mine at Merkers became a vast underground vault, its chambers filling with the concentrated wealth of a dying empire. And then, in early April 1945, as American forces swept across the region, the loading stopped. Reichsbank officials made frantic attempts to remove as much material as possible, but time had run out. The Americans were at the gates. When Colonel Bernstein arrived at General George Patton's Third Army headquarters on Monday, April 9th, he carried orders directly from Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower himself. Bernstein was to verify the contents of the mine, arrange for the treasure to be secured, and oversee its removal to a location safely behind Allied lines. Under the agreements reached by Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin at the Yalta Conference, the region containing Merkers would soon fall under Soviet control. The Americans had a narrow window of time to secure the treasure and move it westward. Patton, never a man known for subtlety or patience, had already ordered tanks to surround the mine entrance. He had also imposed a complete press blackout on the discovery, though information was already beginning to leak. The general had his own ideas about what should be done with captured Nazi gold, ideas that would have horrified the diplomats and politicians who were already planning how to distribute the recovered wealth among the nations Germany had plundered. Silenced to Tuesday, April 10th, engineers from the 90th Infantry Division stood before the massive steel door that sealed Room 8, one of the deepest chambers in the mine. The Reichsbank officials who had supervised the storage operation had taken the keys with them when they fled, and no amount of searching had turned them up. The engineers checked for booby traps, knowing that the retreating Nazis had shown a fondness for leaving deadly surprises behind. Finding none, they packed explosives around the door's hinges and detonated them. The explosion echoed through the mine's corridors, and when the smoke cleared, a hole large enough to admit a man had been blown in the brick masonry beside the door. Bernstein was the first through the opening, followed by Lieutenant Colonel William Dupuy, commander of the 1st Battalion of the 357th Infantry Regiment. Their flashlight beams swept across the chamber, and what they saw left them speechless. The room measured 75 feet wide and approximately $238 million. In today's currency, adjusted for inflation and the dramatic increase in gold prices, it would be worth billions. But these numbers, staggering as they were, told only part of the story. This was not merely gold. This was theft on a continental scale, the systematic looting of entire nations compressed into one underground chamber. The following day, April 11th, 3 of the most important military leaders in the European theatre descended into the mine. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, General Omar Bradley, Commander of the 12th Army Group, and General George Patton himself made the long elevator ride down to the treasure chamber. Bernstein served as their guide, leading them first to room 8 where the gold waited in its eternal darkness. Imiento stood in silence, his face unreadable in the harsh electric light. He was seeing the physical evidence of everything the Allies had been fighting against: the cold calculation, the industrial-scale theft, the complete disregard for human dignity and international law. Bradley moved along the rows of gold bags, occasionally bending to examine the Reichsbank seals stamped on each one. But Patton's attention was elsewhere. He had spotted additional containers, suitcases and trunks stacked against one wall. When these were opened, their contents revealed the depth of Nazi depravity. Impeachment were thousands of items of personal jewellery, gold watches, their mechanisms frozen in time, wedding rings inscribed with dates and names, diamond brooches, pearl necklaces, cigarette cases made of silver and gold, and in several containers, a substance that made even these hardened soldiers turn away in revulsion. Gold dental fillings, thousands upon thousands of them, extracted from the mouths of concentration camp victims. Some still bore traces of the teeth they had been torn from. This was not the abstract evil of military strategy or political ideology. This was the tangible evidence of individual human suffering, multiplied 1,000,000 times over. Bernstein then led the generals to another chamber where the artwork waited. Here were paintings that had graced the walls of Europe's greatest museums and private collections. Manet's In the Winter Garden, a masterpiece of French Impressionism. Works by Rembrandt, including pieces from his late period, when the master had achieved a technique from which it had been stolen, a process that would require careful documentation and negotiation among the Allied powers. The artwork would need to be identified, catalogued, and restituted to museums and, where possible, to the families from whom it had been taken. And the personal items, the jewellery and gold fillings taken from victims of the Holocaust, these would require special handling. They were evidence of crimes that would need to be prosecuted at the war crimes trials that were already being planned. Mientras first, everything needed to be moved. The mine was located in what would soon become the Soviet occupation zone, and while the Soviet Union was an ally in the fight against Germany, the relationship between the Western powers and Stalin's government was already showing signs of strain. Eisenhower wanted this treasure secured in American or British hands, where it could be properly documented and eventually distributed according to international law. Bernstein had already selected a new location for the treasure. The Reichsbank building in Frankfurt, while damaged, was still structurally sound and offered secure vault space. More importantly, Frankfurt was safely within the American occupation zone and would remain under Western control. The operation to move the treasure began immediately. Championship for the next several days, the mine became the site of an enormous logistical operation. Trucks lined up at the entrance, waiting to be loaded with the carefully catalogued gold, currency, and artwork. Each bag of gold was inventoried, its contents verified against Reichsbank records that had been found in the mine. The paintings were examined by art experts, including monuments men, specially trained officers whose mission was to preserve and protect cultural artifacts in war zones. These men, many of whom had been museum curators and art historians in civilian life, carefully documented each piece, photographed it, and supervised its packing for transport. Disarm of the operation was staggering. The gold alone required multiple convoys of heavy trucks. The foreign currency filled dozens of additional vehicles. One shipment contained 98 million French francs. Another held millions in Swiss francs, pounds sterling, and American dollars. The paintings and sculptures required special transport, with shock-absorbing packaging to protect them from the rough roads between Merkers and Frankfurt. German sheepskin greatcoats, originally intended for Wehrmacht troops on the Eastern Front but never delivered, were repurposed as protective padding for the American military operations. The war in the Pacific was still raging, and the invasion of Japan, if it proved necessary, would require enormous resources. Why send this gold back to European nations that had failed to stop Hitler in the first place? Why not use it to support American troops who were still dying to defeat Japan? It was a pragmatic argument, but it ignored the fundamental principle that the Allies claimed to be fighting for: the rule of law and the recognition that nations and individuals had rights that must be respected, even in wartime. Silenced Eisenhower, Bradley, and the political leaders in Washington rejected Patton's proposal. The gold would be held in trust until proper restitution arrangements could be made. On January 14, 1946, the precious metals were transferred to the Inter-Allied Reparation Agency, a newly created organization tasked with overseeing the return of looted property to its rightful owners. The process would take decades. Some gold was returned to central banks relatively quickly, once ownership could be clearly established. The gold looted from the Belgian National Bank, for example, was eventually returned to Belgium. Gold taken from the Netherlands went back to Dutch authorities. But other portions of the Merkers treasure posed more difficult questions. The gold that had been melted down from jewellery and dental fillings taken from Holocaust victims had no clear owners. The people it had been stolen from were dead, murdered in gas chambers or worked to death in labour camps. Their families had been destroyed. In many cases, there was no one left to file a claim. This non-monetary gold, as it came to be known in official documents, remained in storage at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York for decades. Only in 1997, more than 50 years after its discovery, was a final decision made about its disposition. The gold was donated to a fund established to provide assistance to survivors of Nazi persecution. The artwork recovered at Merkers followed a similar path of gradual restitution. The paintings that had been stolen from museums were generally easier to return, as their provenance, their history of ownership, was well documented. Museum records showed which pieces had been in Berlin's collections before the war, and these were returned to German museums once the country stabilized. But many of the works at Merkers had been looted from private collections, primarily from Jewish families in occupied territories. Historians attempted to trace their ownership. Even today, more than 75 years after the end of World War II, artwork stolen by the Nazis continues to surface in auctions and private collections, triggering legal battles over rightful ownership. The discovery at Merkers was not an isolated incident. As American, British, and Soviet forces advanced across Germany in the spring of 1945, they uncovered cache after cache of hidden Nazi treasure. In salt mines across the country, in remote castles, in the basements of destroyed buildings, the evidence of systematic looting accumulated. In one location, troops found gold bars that had been dumped into a lake, weighted down and left at the bottom in the desperate final days of the war. In another, artwork was discovered hidden in railway tunnels, stacked in minecarts and covered with protective tarps. But Merkers remained the most significant find, both for the sheer quantity of treasure it contained and for what it revealed about the nature of the Nazi regime. This was not wealth earned through productive labour or honest commerce. It was the concentrated essence of theft, slavery, and murder. Every gold bar represented a looted central bank or a melted wedding ring. Every painting represented a family destroyed or a museum emptied. The Merkers treasure was a physical manifestation of the catastrophic evil that had consumed Europe for 6 years. The story of how this treasure was discovered also reveals something important about the nature of liberation. It was 2 displaced French women who provided the crucial tip that led to the mine's discovery. They had been victims of Nazi aggression, torn from their homes and forced into labour. They had every reason to remain silent, to avoid drawing attention to themselves in a world where survival often depended on invisibility. But they chose to speak. They chose to trust American soldiers with information that could have put them at risk if the Germans had learned of their betrayal. Their decision demonstrates the desperate hope that ordinary people placed in the Allied liberation, a hope that justice might finally be possible after years of tyranny. The American soldiers who investigated the tip, who descended into the mine, who secured and catalogued the treasure, were mostly young men far from home. Many had never been outside their home states before the war. They found themselves thrust into situations that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. Standing in underground, your hand the gold filling that had been torn from the mouth of someone's grandmother or child. The makers could have stolen from the treasure. The security was not perfect, especially in the first few days before Eisenhower's arrival. A few gold coins or a small piece of jewellery could have been pocketed without anyone noticing. The temptation must have been enormous, especially for men who came from hard-scrabble backgrounds, where a single gold coin represented more wealth than their families had ever possessed. But by all accounts, theft was minimal to non-existent. The soldiers understood that this was not theirs to take. They were liberators, not looters. They were fighting to restore justice to a world that had been consumed by injustice. To steal from the Merkers' treasure would have been to become, in some small way, like the enemy they had been fighting. Since World War II, the story of Hitler's gold has taken on mythical proportions. Treasure hunters still search for legendary Nazi gold trains, supposedly hidden in sealed tunnels beneath the Polish mountains. Divers explore alpine lakes looking for gold bars supposedly dumped there in the final days of the war. Some of these stories have a basis in fact. The Nazis did attempt to hide significant quantities of gold in remote locations as the Reich collapsed. But many of the stories are exaggerations or complete fabrications. Modern legends that have grown up around the very real horrors of the war. Minimized, as revealed by the discovery at Merkers and dozens of similar finds, was that most of the Nazi gold was recovered by Allied forces in 1945 and 1946. It was catalogued, documented, and gradually returned to its rightful owners or their governments. The process was slow, bureaucratic, and imperfect. Some victims never received compensation. Some families continued fighting for decades to recover stolen property. But the fundamental principle was upheld, that stolen property should be returned, that crimes should be documented and prosecuted, that even in the chaos of a world war, justice matters. Today, the salt mine at Merkers is a tourist attraction. Visitors can descend into the depths where the Nazi treasure once waited in darkness. They can stand in the chambers where Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton once stood, contemplating the physical evidence of systematic evil. The gold is long gone, returned to central banks or melted down and reminted. The artwork has been dispersed, but because they prevented the Nazis from using their stolen wealth to escape justice or fund a resurgent movement. Operation Safe Haven achieved its primary goal. The rat lines that spirited Nazi leaders to South America could not be funded by Reich gold. The Fourth Reich that some Nazi true believers dreamed of could not be financed by looted treasure. The gold was recovered, documented, and returned. Justice, imperfect and delayed as it was, eventually prevailed. And in a world that had seen such catastrophic injustice, that victory mattered more than all the treasure that filled the chambers beneath Merkers.